I will do this, but I will do this. I will do more. I will do more better. Do. That is what Americans have come to expect from their government leaders. While running for office, the biggest question voters will ask is, what will you do? But not many people ask, how much will you do? Or even more generally, how much should my elected leaders do? But these questions raise one other very important question. Can a president do less and still be successful? The simple answer is yes. In fact, the United States has had such a president. In a time where presidents began to expect themselves to take charge and do more, one president took a stand and successfully led the country by one simple premise: do less. This man took a stand in a more reserved, silent way. Ladies and gentlemen, the 30th President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, taking a stand through inaction. John Calvin Coolidge was born to Victoria Josephine Moore Coolidge and his father, whom he was named after, on July 4th, 1872, in the small village of Plymouth Notch, Vermont. From an early age, Calvin's father raised him to be conservative, honest, diligent, hard-working, and to hold a respect for business. 2 years after graduating from Amherst College in 1895, Coolidge passed the bar exam and opened up a law office in Northampton, Massachusetts, where he would also participate in the local politics. The quiet and modest Coolidge began his political career in 1898, when he was elected to the Northampton City Council. He was then appointed as city solicitor in 1900, elected county clerk in 1903, and earned a chairmanship in the local Republican Party organization in 1904. 2 years later, Coolidge was elected to the state's House of Representatives. In 1910, Coolidge was elected mayor. 2 years later, Coolidge won a statewide race for the state Senate. Coolidge methodically rose through the ranks in state politics until he eventually became Massachusetts state governor in 1918. Coolidge governed much like his personality. Calvin didn't speak much and was very frugal with his words. In fact, his nickname was Silent Cal. He was quiet and somber. He usually never said more than what was necessary, and he often wore a sour expression on his face. But underneath his rather humble appearance laid a dry British wit. He brought these traits into his political beliefs, as Coolidge became well known for being a small government conservative. He firmly believed that the government ought to be involved as little as possible in people's lives. On top of which, he was very pro-business, believing that private enterprise drove the economy. Though his term as governor was relatively progressive, as he supported a pay increase for public employees, limited the workweek for women and children, and limited outdoor advertising. He gained national attention, however, when he called the National Guard to restore order to the city of Boston, after lawlessness and riots broke out from the Boston Police Force's strike. He took a strong stand against rehiring the striking officers, famously exclaiming by telegram to the American Federation of Labor Union leader Samuel Gompers, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime." Coolidge was looked upon favorably and his reaction was widely popular. With a steady rise through politics, Coolidge would begin his road to the White House as the 1920 presidential election approached. He was chosen as the state's favorite for the Republican nomination, but received only 34 votes from the convention. A backroom deal ensured Warren G. Harding's nomination, and Coolidge wasn't even considered for the second spot. However, when Coolidge's name was introduced onto the ticket, a swoop of rebellious delegates got Coolidge onto the ticket. Harding's and Coolidge's campaign would serve as a stark contrast to their opponents, Democratic presidential nominee James M. Cox and vice presidential nominee Franklin Roosevelt. While Cox traveled over 20,000 miles and spoke to 2 million people, Harding ran a front porch campaign from his home in Marion, Ohio, and Coolidge did a modest amount of campaigning in the South, in a vain attempt to sway the loyally Democratic region. And what a contrast Harding served to Coolidge himself. Coolidge's serious, no-nonsense attitude was like night and day compared to Harding's reputation as a good fellow, preferring to make few enemies and be well liked rather than to take serious stances and be an effective leader. But by the end of the election, Harding won the presidency by an unprecedented 60% of the popular vote, and the Republicans in Congress were easily able to get the president's signature onto their bills. Harding was typically conservative in terms of economic policy, such as slashing taxes, removing wartime controls, and letting the resulting surge from the end of a post-war depression flourish by keeping the government out of the private sector as much as possible, keeping true to his campaign promise, less government in business and more business in government. But all was not well, as it was revealed to Harding that many of the people he appointed to his cabinet were using their positions for their own enrichment. Shaken by these revelations, Harding and his wife began to tour the western states to try and explain his policies. Shockingly, however, President Harding died of a heart attack in San Francisco in August of 1923. And this is how Mr. Coolidge was first brought to the Oval Office. Vice President Coolidge kept a low profile and played little role in Harding's administration, as was the Vice President's chief duty at the time. He spoke seldom during cabinet meetings and while serving as the Senate's presiding officer. He mainly devoted his time to making public speeches, but at the time of Harding's death, Mr. and Mrs. Coolidge were vacationing at the family home in Plymouth Notch. In the early morning of August 2, 1923, John Coolidge Sr. woke his son to alert him of Harding's death, and at 2:24 a.m., the home abuzz with reporters, the elder Coolidge, a justice of the peace, administered the oath of office to Calvin Coolidge on the family Bible. Coolidge emerged unscathed from the scandals that plagued the previous administration, and he launched the investigation into the Teapot Dome scandal that put Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, in prison. And he dismissed Harding's disgraced Attorney General, Harry Daughtry, after he evaded impeachment from Congress and 2 indictments. Through this, Coolidge secured his reputation as an honest and hard-working individual. With the economy prospering by the time of the next election in 1924, Coolidge was ready to run a campaign and win the presidency in his own right. Coolidge ran against Democrat John Davis and Progressive Robert La Follette and won with a total of 382 electoral votes and 54% of the popular vote. The Coolidge administration was a resounding success, with Coolidge seeing results that modern presidents strive for today, especially economic. There was low unemployment, often below 5%. The federal budget slashed almost in half, and the maximum federal surtax lowered to 20%. Average manufacturing labor hours fell from 56 to 44 hours, but wages rose 25%. And new technology was made for the masses, such as affordable automobiles like the Ford Model T and A, electricity for 2/3 of the population, and radio. In fact, Coolidge was the first president to give radio-specific addresses, and he was the first president to appear in a talking film.
I want the people of America to be able to work less for the government and more for themselves.
The social landscape was changing too, with up to 1/3 of urban women living independently, the average American family spending more time and money on recreation, and dates becoming a more common phenomenon. The era was so prosperous that it is now known as the Roaring Twenties. How did Coolidge achieve all of this? In a time where progressives were demanding action, such as aid for agriculture and nationalizing industries like the railroad, Coolidge avoided taking action as much as possible. Coolidge believed in a hands-off approach to his leadership, a big step away from the progressive activist personalities that Roosevelt and Wilson had established before him. He delegated most executive tasks to his cabinet, vetoed over 50 bills, made regular use of the pocket veto, left most issues to the states, and exercised restraint to the federal measures he did handle. "Don't hurry to legislate," Coolidge said. Though many historians like Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. dismiss Coolidge as a lazy president, that's simply not true. In fact, quite the opposite was true. All of Coolidge's action and inaction was done with deliberate intent. For example, despite being from a farming community himself, Coolidge blocked farm subsidies. He actively disavowed anything beyond minimal federal regulations of business, commerce, or labor, and imposed the same discipline on Congress. Plus, he was one of the most visible presidents to date, giving on average 8 press conferences a month, giving monthly radio addresses, and liberally allowing himself to be photographed. One could say that Coolidge was an actively inactive president. When it comes down to it, parties are simply labels. It comes down to individual actions to make a difference in politics. Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt may have been in different parties, but they both changed the tone of American politics by the 20th century with their outsized progressive spirits. Coolidge actively stood against that, showing that inaction and a hands-off leadership can be just as effective as taking action. Coolidge's stand could perhaps be a lesson to us all. Perhaps it can once again inspire leaders to have the same strength to do nothing. Calvin Coolidge, taking a stand through inaction.